You're listening to the Grassroots Church podcast. We're a Jesus-centered community in Thunder Bay, Ontario. You can learn how to participate more by going to our website at grassroots.church.
Good morning. This is it's good energy in here this morning. I'm about to change all of that. We are kind of in a hurry to get all the stuff packed up and out, so I'm going to just jump right into our message this morning. We are on part 2 of our series, a 3-part series on the topic of forgiveness, and can be a bit heavy. As I prepared this week, I was like, forgiveness isn't just light, fluffy stuff. It's deep. There's big implications for the work of forgiveness and holding back forgiveness. And so, anyway, just fair warning. Last week, we began by looking at sort of 3 levels of forgiveness. We talked about just the first level. This morning we're going to explore level 2, but level 1 is simply, we said, releasing others from the debt they owe us. So choosing not to retaliate, not to push back, responding in kind to whatever offense was directed or perpetrated toward us. This is basic forgiveness 101. And we said last week that this is to be the posture that followers of Jesus are to strive toward. This is the goal for how we are to instinctively live, the way that we just instinctively breathe. We don't even have to think about it. That forgiveness just kind of becomes the way that we live. And that's a tall order. It's a challenge, isn't it? But this is kind of what Jesus was getting at when he was responding to Peter. When Peter said, Jesus, how many times should we forgive? 7 times? He said, Peter, not 7 times, but 70 times 7 times. And again, the point of it is, don't keep track of how many offenses are against you. Don't keep track of every slight, every time someone hurts you, and I know that's hard, he's saying, but the idea is that you live from a default posture of grace exuding out. And you do that by understanding the grace that has been shown you. And so we breathe in grace and we breathe out forgiveness. When we understand that we have been forgiven, it allows us to then forgive others. And a lot of this can just live in this sort of theoretical world where we don't really, we're like, we agree with that in principle. But man, when it comes to the mud and the mire of real life and where we put that into action, that's where it is often a challenge, right? And we said forgiveness is like marriage. So level 1 of forgiveness is just the wedding day. You can't have a marriage without the wedding day. But that's just the beginning. And so level 2 and level 3 of forgiveness is where the marriage takes place itself. This is where the real work kind of begins. And so this morning we're going to look at just level 2. And we said level 2 is, level 1 was dealing with releasing others, releasing the debt owed. Level 1 is releasing your heart and allowing yourself to be healed. So level 2, we can say this, releasing our hearts from anger and resentment. This is what Paul writes in his letter to the church at Ephesus, chapter 4. He says this, it's just like straight teaching from Paul. Here's how you are to live, he says. Get rid of all bitterness, rage and anger, brawling and slander, along with every form of malice. And so we're like, okay. And then he says, be kind and compassionate. So replace it with kindness and compassion and to one another, forgiving each other, just as in Christ God forgave you. And so again, we begin by releasing others from the debt owed to us, but then we continue down the road of forgiveness by actively addressing our own hearts, those feelings of anger and bitterness and rage and resentment and on and on. And how is this done? Paul lays out very clearly. It is done through forgiving in the same way Christ has forgiven us. And so here again, we are reminded, if you remember last week, we began to look at the parable of the unmerciful servant in Matthew 18. And so Jesus tells of this king who forgives his servant this outrageous debt that could never be paid back after he begs for mercy. And then that same servant goes out and sees one of his servants who owes him a couple $1,000, say. And he is not willing to show mercy to that servant. And instead he throws him in jail. And then the king, of course, witnesses all this, or somebody tells him about it, and the word gets back to him, and he says, I gave you all this mercy. I showed all this grace and forgiveness to you, and yet you weren't willing to do that to your servant? And so he throws him in prison as a consequence. And the point, Jesus is saying, is that the man, the servant here, his servant, failed to recognize that he had been forgiven so much, and rather than transmit that forgiveness on forward, rather than pay it forward, it stops with him. And in doing so, he is imprisoned. And so that third servant that owed that small debt was living rent-free in the other servant's head, right? This servant was not able to cling to grace or to transmit grace because he was hung up on justice, or he did not want to be slighted, or he didn't want to be taken advantage of, or whatever the reason might be. The parable doesn't tell us, but he's not able to see the grace that was given to him as something he needs to transmit elsewhere. He is stuck in that. And so when we forgive, the goal is not just to release others from the debt prison that they are stuck in, but also for ourselves to no longer be enslaved to the resentment and to the bitterness and to the anger and to the slander and to the malice and to all of these emotions and feelings that we all know too well, because we've all been hurt. We've all been slighted. We've all been taken advantage of. We've all been hurt in some way, shape, or form. And these are very natural, very real, expected feelings that come as a result. And what Jesus is saying is that unless we are able to forgive, and what Paul is saying is unless we are able to forgive, we cannot be released from the prison of resentment and anger and all of that. And there's been lots that has been written and said about this sort of counterintuitive logic. The Christian ethicist Lewis Smedes, this very famous quote, he said, "To forgive is to set a prisoner free, and to discover that prisoner was you." How many people have heard that quote before? Right? To forgive is to set the prisoner free and to discover that you were the prisoner. A pastor that I follow who's in Austin, Texas, his name is Zach Lambert. He wrote, "Unforgiveness is a prison sentence we place upon ourselves." Unforgiveness, holding back forgiveness, is a prison sentence we place upon ourselves. Hate, resentment, and the right to revenge, these are all chains that keep us forever bound to our pain and suffering, as well as the person or the people who caused them. And one more, James Baldwin, who is a famous civil rights activist, he worked alongside Martin Luther King Jr. He himself experienced the injustices of a society perpetrated directly toward him. And so this comes out of his own experience, and he says, hatred, which could destroy so much, never failed to destroy the man who hated. Like, this is the power of these emotions and these feelings. They consume us more than they consume the person who perpetrated any evil or wrongdoing against us. Which is a tough lesson and a really hard truth to grapple with. We don't like that. We don't like that, but the principle or the axiom or the truth or whatever you want to say, it could be worded this way. The keys to our own prison are held by us, and we can decide when we want to come out. Anytime we want. We get to decide that. Right? And this is a prison that is, made of steel bars of resentment and steel bars of hate and steel bars of malice and bitterness. Bitterness is such a strong, strong prison to be stuck in. Right? And we may, after we see that this is the way forgiveness works, we may ask this question: why should the one who was hurt be on the hook to take this first step toward forgiveness? Why should the one who was embarrassed or shamed or abused or lied to, why should they be the one to initiate mercy? Doesn't it make sense that it should come from the other person? And you are absolutely right, it should. You would be 100% vindicated in withholding mercy from the person that hurt you. 100 judges and 1,000 juries would look at your situation and they would be like, yeah, there is no expectation for you to extend mercy to the person that hurt you, the person that offended you. That is not necessary. That is not what justice looks like. You do not owe anyone anything. You've been hurt. You can stay in your corner and wait for that person to reach out to you. You're free to do that, and you're absolutely in your right to do that. Right? It is not fair. It's not fair. And yet, be that as it may be, if you've ever grappled with forgiveness and forgiving someone, you know that it doesn't start with the other person. It has to start with you, right? In order to be released from the prison of resentment and hate, you need to turn the key of forgiveness and walk out the door. Nelson Mandela, who I think all of us probably in this room know who he is, he experienced this firsthand. He spent 27 years in prison, right? Unjustly placed there for the role he played in fighting apartheid in South Africa. And this, again, was an unjust sentence by all accounts. 27 years. It's like a third of his life was behind bars. And this is what he says. He says, as I walked out the door toward the gate that would lead to my freedom, I knew if I didn't leave my bitterness and hatred behind, I would still be in prison. Right? I would still be in prison. And so the question then becomes, okay, despite this being grossly unfair, which we all agree it is, nobody's arguing that, how might we go about enacting forgiveness in ways that release our hearts from this prison? How might we go about doing this? And there are a myriad of ways, but I kind of came up with just two that I think I'd like to look at as we consider this. And the first is to realize, and this is more with you than anyone else, the first is to realize that forgiveness is rarely a one and done occurrence, right? Forgiveness is rarely a one and done event. In other words, it requires time and intentionality. And again, if somebody says something rude to you, that's different than if somebody abused you in your childhood or, caused some lasting damage. Some of this stuff you can forgive, just like, okay, you know what? I'm actually not going to be bothered by this, and I'm cool, and my heart is healed, and I'm ready to rock. But a lot of the stuff, the hurt, the pain that we have felt, takes more than just a one and done time, right? And if you've ever struggled with forgiving someone because they've done something that has caused lasting hurt and trauma in your life that maybe has impacted the trajectory of your life for the worse, like it's negatively impacted the outcome or the hopes you had in your life, then you'll know that releasing anger or letting go of the past is rarely just a single decision, akin to flipping a switch. That's not how forgiveness typically works, right? Anyone who has experienced this knows. William Paul Young, remember the book The Shack? How many years ago do you think that book came out, by the way? Yeah, 19 years ago. It came out in 2007. Can you believe that? That blew my mind that it came out that long ago. I am way older than I feel. By the way, there's a part 2 of this book coming out this fall. So if you like the book The Shack, and you found value, then maybe look for it. Anyway, this is what he wrote. You may have to declare your forgiveness 100 times the first day and the second day, but the third day it will be less, and each day after, until one day you will realize that you have forgiven completely. And I feel like this captures actual forgiveness, the process, the journey of forgiveness more accurately, doesn't it? For most of us. Yeah. The reality is, just because the debt may have been forgiven, again, that's level one, those feelings of resentment and bitterness and anger and all that, they don't just magically disappear overnight. And this is because this is a work of the heart, not of the mind. Right? Forgiveness is a work of the heart, not of the mind. We can forgive someone intellectually and be like, yes, I release that person from the debt. I will not retaliate. Again, that's level one. But level two takes time. And interesting, this is how Jesus ends his parable of the unmerciful servant in Matthew 18. This is what he says. He turns to his disciples after saying what happens to this unmerciful servant being put in jail and all that. And he says, this is how my heavenly Father will treat each of you unless you forgive your brother or your sister from your heart. From your heart. Forgiveness has to come from our heart in order for it to truly free us. And I don't know if it needs to be said, but he's not referring to this pounding muscle in our chest, right? This is the word we use for heart, but the heart refers to not just our mind, but our will and our emotions, our whole sort of being. And we don't have a great word for that, but we use this word heart to refer to that. And so our minds, we say, can be changed in a moment if there's enough convincing information. We can switch like a light switch, but our hearts typically need to be massaged, right? We need to process that. And that requires effort, and it requires intentionality, and it requires prayer, and it requires time. And there's no limit as to how long that time must be. And Jesus knows it's not enough to just cancel that debt. That doesn't heal us. It maybe alleviates pressure from the other side and allows that person to go free, but it doesn't heal us. It's a start. It's the wedding day, but it isn't the fullness of marriage. Every day is a decision to stay committed to this person and in that marriage, and every day is a decision to intentionally continue to forgive and to offer grace to the person that hurt us, even if we don't immediately feel it. And like Young says, eventually, one day you will realize that your heart has forgiven them and you're able to move out of this prison. And you might just be reflecting and be like, oh, actually, I don't hold any more malice in my heart. You might not be able to pinpoint the time when that happens, but if you've gone through the journey of forgiveness, you've experienced this, right? You can look at a person and be like, wow, I'm no longer bitter toward them. I can actually move on, enjoy. So that's the first step. And the second step, I thought I would just share a story that I got out of the Forgiveness Project. And has anyone heard of the Forgiveness Project? Yeah? So this is a UK-based UK-based charity that uses storytelling and kind of creative approaches to help people explore the complexities of forgiveness. And so I've been reading some of their stories and some of the work that they've done over the last week or two, and just some really inspiring and heart-wrenching stories. I encourage you to check it out online. Theforgivenessproject.com is my guess, but you can probably just Google it. Anyway, so one story I encountered, I think, really gets at kind of what the second way of how we take forgiveness as more than an intellectual thing and move it to our hearts. And it's a story about Beth, and I guess a bit of a trigger warning. Beth talks about abuse, but I'll keep it very high level, general. So she was abused. She's 67 years old, and she was abused by her father when she was 7. And her father has, long since passed away now. But she wrote this: "The abuse tore me from my childhood, and it hurt me profoundly. For all those years, in my mind, he ceased to be a person, let alone my father. I was unable to focus on him as anything other than an amorphous entity that somehow represented all that was bad. It wasn't worth my time too much. It wasn't worth my time wasting too much thought on him. So that was her relationship with her father. And then her and her husband adopted a 7-year-old boy who had come from his own sort of background with abuse and carried all sorts of anger and just hatred in his heart and directed it at Beth and her husband. And so they raised this son just in a very sort of tumultuous home as well. Yet she was able to forgive her son over and over again. And she writes this, she says, "I knew why he behaved that way, and I chose to respond with as much understanding and patience as I could muster. He received professional help, and eventually his anger subsided, and he has become a kind and generous and a loving son." And so Beth understood her son's source of anger, and it allowed her to continuously extend grace, which is a beautiful thing and can be a challenging thing. But in this case, she was able to. And eventually, as Beth got older, she decided she was done with her own anger and done with the resentment and the bitterness that she held in her head and in her heart. And she was done with the prison, being imprisoned by herself in this way. But of course, her father had passed away. And so how could she process this? How could she deal with her father? She couldn't speak to him anymore. She writes this, she said, "I found myself wondering why I could forgive my son time and time again, and yet it had taken me so long to forgive my father. Of course, I understood my son's reasons for his behavior, but I never stopped to think of my father's reasons for his actions." Again, her father had died years earlier, but she began to do some research and to discover his upbringing. He was one of 4 children whose father passed away when he was 8 years old, and that resulted in a very tumultuous upbringing, right? It was just hardship after hardship after hardship in his life, and then he went off to war, World War II, and experienced terrible things there, and they didn't have the mental health supports or anything like that, and so when he came back from the war, he was a broken man, and like so many other people, he turned to alcohol for comfort and became dependent on that. And with that realization of his journey, right, with that understanding, it grew in Beth the compassion she needed to forgive her dad, right? To release her anger and her bitterness and just the hatred that she held in her heart. It took seeing her father's broken humanity to allow her to find a release from the prison of bitterness and resentment. And this is what she wrote. She wrote, "When I pieced together his past, I found myself wishing with all my heart that I could see him again. I could put my arms around him and ask him to tell me about his life. And I would tell him that I truly forgave him." So this path to forgiveness that Beth took, and so many people, I'm sure you know people like this, maybe you've walked this journey yourself, the difficult journey of forgiving someone who did just unspeakable damage and pain to you. But that path to forgiveness was not forgetting what happened to her. It was not excusing or diminishing the gravity or the seriousness of it. It wasn't removing the consequences. None of that stuff. That's not what forgiveness is. None of that, right? But the path of forgiveness was found through, listen to this, empathy. We talked a bit about empathy last fall when we talked about what does it mean to be a mature follower of Jesus. And man, what a gift empathy is toward doing that, right? And this is also the key here. When Beth was able to see the brokenness of her father's story, it gave her the ability to be filled with compassion and to forgive him 60 years later. And this has been, my experience and how I've interacted with people who I've been offended by. When I have the means and the ability to put myself in their shoes to understand the story that they are living and why they might have chosen such destructive and harmful and hurtful things toward me, it has given me the grace He's given me the compassion to extend to them. And I'm sure many of you can relate to that and know that that's a truth. And so if forgiveness is the key to unlocking the prison of our own bitterness and resentment and anger and all this, then empathy is the hand that turns the key. So let me sum up this morning then as we close. To be released of our anger and our bitterness and our resentment, it can only be a work of the heart. And the heart does not switch like a light switch, right? It just doesn't work that way. We can say the words, "We forgive you," and we can even mean it, but our hearts might drag behind. And in the wake and in the process of that dragging behind, we can grow in our resentment, in our bitterness, and all these things. And so there are two things, perhaps, and there are definitely more than this, but two things that we've looked at here: time and intentionality. Be willing to just go easy on yourself and recognize that forgiveness doesn't happen overnight. And you don't need to beat yourself up if you're still struggling with it, and nobody's condemning you. There's no shame. So that's the first part. And then the second part is just having compassion through empathy, right? Like that's it. And so my encouragement to each of us this morning as we grapple with mercy for those who clearly don't deserve it, right? Just keep turning the key. Keep choosing the unfair, totally, you're not in the wrong to not feel this way, but keep choosing the path of forgiveness, even if and when our hearts may be slow to follow. Amen. And over time, I think, by the grace of God, empathy can soften what bitterness and resentment has hardened in our hearts. And I think that that is the journey to be released from the prison of our own making, and allow us to walk in the freedom of Christ. This is what is on offer as followers of Jesus.